She once spun joy from silver thread, asked deep questions, danced and read. But under all her curious light lay seams pulled taut, stretched too tight. Her sense of self, a jumper worn, soft in parts and others torn. She smiled wide, but deep inside her confidence had learned to hide. Stood at the edges in group photos, kind but quiet, easy to miss. Never chosen, always present, like a shadow you forget exists. She thought maybe I'd take up too much space, a fate in shape you can't replace. She didn't want to make them ache, so she held her sorrow for their sake. You're too sensitive, you disappoint. Thoughts caught like thread on a jagged point. She tried to mend them, think them through, but the spiral stitched her spirit blue. F is the fragile name she wore. A is the ache of being ignored. B is the burden she never shared. R is the reel of thoughts ensnared. I is the trap that had no door. C is the curtain that closed the floor. This is fabric, thread by thread, quiet and unraveling few can tread. Winter came with grief and loss, a job, a health scare, one more cost. The exits faded one by one, and all her color came undone. The future blurred into a fog, even music felt like a hollow log. Hope once hung beneath her days, now even that had lost its place. This is where we meet her, not too late, not after the fall, but near the gate. Not to take the needle in our hand, but to sit and help her understand where the thread is pulling tight, where the cloth has lost its light. Cause pain shows up where meaning lives, and what still matters softly gives. F is the feeling she couldn't name. A is the ache of silent shame. B is the story she carried alone. R is the loop that never was shown. I is the cage of circumstance. C is the loss of a second chance. But fabric worn is fabric still, and threads can shift with gentle will. Every fray began with feeling, every tear begins with thread. But even worn cloth holds a promise that it's not the end, just where we're led.
Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the Protect podcast, where we are exploring Steps for Hope, the fourth volume in the Steps book series. I'm Manan, and I'm glad you're here, whether you're joining us again or just tuning in for the first time. In this episode, we begin our journey through the Steps framework. This is episode 2 of season 4. So we'll be beginning with the very first phase, fabric. This phase explores predisposition, the quiet, early signs that someone's emotional fabric may be beginning to fray. In our last episode, we all met Ari. We traced her journey from the outside in, watching the slow, subtle unraveling of life's weave. Ari's story isn't just hers, it mirrors the story of many people who carry pain in silence. We also introduced the idea of the loom, the metaphor that holds this entire framework together. A loom stretches life's threads into shape. But when those threads pull too tight or begin to fray, it tells us something is shifting beneath the surface. That's what the Steps framework is designed to notice. So let's take a step back before we move forward. The Steps framework maps out the progression of suicidal risk in 6 phases: fabric or predisposition, thread, early ideation, needle, sharpening intention, tip, is the tipping point or action. Mend, the pause after an attempt, so the post-attempt phase. Flow, or recovery in motion or life in motion, however you want to phrase it. Each step in this model captures a different kind of distress, a different shape of emotional pain, and each step invites us to respond differently. That's why we have paired each one with an acronym. The acronyms aren't just memory tools, they are guideposts. Because when you're sitting with someone in deep distress, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, unsure of what to ask or where to begin. These acronyms help us slow down. They help us notice what hurts and how we might ask about it gently, thoughtfully, and without rushing into safety plans or solutions too soon. Today, we begin with fabric, the first fray. The fabric begins to fray before the pattern disappears. Fabric is not a checklist. It is a clinical metaphor and a relational invitation to notice the earliest signs of distress that precede suicidal ideation. These are not yet cries for death, but quiet signals of emotional wear. As clinicians, peers, or helpers, our task is to see the strain before the snap. We begin by exploring the 6 emotional threads that often thin before risk becomes visible. F is for fragile sense of self. When identity starts to wear thin, a person may feel hollowed out, unsure of who they are or whether they still matter. So the clinical aim here is to understand how the person sees themselves and whether the weave of self-worth is holding. So you can use these questions to explore, and good open question could be, how do you see yourself these days? When do you feel most unsure of who you are? Closed questions could be like, are these things you used to feel confident about that now feel harder? Or do you still feel proud of anything you have done recently? Well, that's a mixture of open and closed. Sometimes people feel like a shadow of themselves. Has anything recently made you feel that way? So that's a good relational prompt. So here, open questions invite narrative, emotion, and metaphor. If the person is silent or stuck, a closed question can provide a firmer foothold, not to corner them, but to gently orient the conversation. Open and closed questions are tools of rhythm, not just structure. The next letter in fabric, A, is for alienation. Alienation is not just loneliness, it's the ache of feeling invisible, even when surrounded. The relational tether loosens. So the clinical aim here is to explore whether the person feels emotionally disconnected, unseen, or unimportant to others. So questions you can explore here are like, even when you are with others, do you sometimes feel alone? Have you pulled back from any people or places recently? Do you feel emotionally close to anyone right now? Have you been spending more time alone than usual? So again, a mixture of open and closed questions. So a relational prompt, many people retreat when they are in pain. Has that been happening for you? Asking into alienation requires warmth and care. Silence here isn't resistance. It may be a reflection of relational exhaustion. When emotional distance is the wound, connection is part of the medicine. The next letter B, burdensomeness. When someone starts to feel like a weight, not just struggling, but believing they are the problem, the thread of worth begins to fray. So the clinical aim here is gently assess whether the person believes their existence creates harm or hardship for others. So you can use questions like, what do you think others would say about the role you play in their lives? That's a nice open question. Closed questions like, do you ever worry others would be better off without you? Or do you feel like your presence causes stress for people you care about? A nice relational prompt here could be, It's not uncommon for people in distress to feel like they are a burden, even if others wouldn't agree. Has that crossed your mind? So you're using techniques like normalization in order to create relational safety so that someone can open up. The key here is not to argue with the belief, but to explore its emotional roots. These questions often surface deep shame. Sitting with that shame without rushing to reassure builds trust. So, moving on, the next letter in fabric, R, repetitive rumination. This is the mental echo, the loop of blame, self criticism, or intrusive thought that never lets up. So, the clinical aim here is identify cognitive patterns that trap the person in self directed pain or helplessness. So, questions here that you can use: do certain thoughts keep looping in your mind? Can you share them with me? When something goes wrong, where does your mind usually go? Have your thoughts become more self critical lately? So, this is a closed question. Do you find it hard to stop beating yourself up? A nice relational prompt could be: when distressed, some people feel like their mind becomes an echo chamber. Has that ever felt true for you? So, open questions allow you to follow the thread of thought. Closed ones help when the person is stuck inside the loop. Ruminated pain is often wrapped in silence. These questions offer a way to speak what has been circling. Next letter, I, inescapable circumstances. Here the person feels emotionally or practically trapped, as though all exits are blocked. So the clinical aim here is to understand whether the person feels boxed in, stuck, or powerless to change their life. So questions that you can use: what do you see as the next step, if any? It's a nice open question, and it's future focused and prompts hope as well. Have you felt like you have tried everything and nothing has worked? Do you feel like your situation is unchangeable? Have you felt helpless, like there's no way out? A nice relational prompt would be: feeling stuck can be one of the hardest things. Would it be okay if we explored what's making things feel so tight right now? When someone cannot see future, our role is not to force one, but to sit beside the stuckness and gently hold the space open. The next letter in fabric, C, curtain of despair. The future fades, not just in hope, but in visibility. It becomes blank, colorless, and unreachable. So the clinical aim here is to explore whether the person can still imagine anything ahead, even a moment of relief, beauty, or change. So questions you can use are like: when you think about the future, what comes to mind? It's a very broad, open question. Has it become hard to picture anything beyond this point? Do you believe things could ever get better? Have you lost the ability to imagine feeling okay again? Each of these three closed questions can very easily be changed into an open question. A nice relational prompt could be: it can feel like the light at the end of the tunnel has gone out. Has it started to feel that way for you? Very easy to turn it into an open question. Still using things like normalization and shame attenuation techniques to lay the relational context, and just change something from "has it started to feel that way for you" to "how is it for you?" And it becomes an open question. And you base your questions based on how the person's tracking. When hopelessness sets in, it is not enough to counter with optimism. We listen, not to fix, but to witness the dimming and to hold space for even the faintest flicker. A lot of what I am sharing today is about the art of asking. The questions we ask in the fabric phase are not diagnostic tools. They are acts of relational noticing. They help us understand not only what hurts, but how pain is worn. So you need to balance open and closed questions. Open questions create space. They allow the person to narrate, interpret, and shape their story in their own words. They communicate curiosity, not control. Closed questions provide footholds, especially when the person feels flooded, frozen, or unsure where to begin. They can gently narrow the lens without shutting the person down. And sequence matters. Start open, listen for themes, shift to closed only when clarity is needed or when the person seems overwhelmed by too much space. Follow ups, they will deepen meaning. Almost any closed question can be followed with, "Can you tell me a little bit more about that?" Or "What makes you feel that way?" So you have gone back to an open question. Fabric is not a race towards a safety plan. It is a way of pausing at the first sign of threadbare emotion and saying with presence, "I see the fray, and I am not turning away." Let's come back to Ari. Her cloth was never pristine, but it held. In childhood, she sparked with curiosity. She asked bold questions, made strange but thoughtful connections, noticed when others were hurting. There was warmth in her weave, softness, sensitivity, a hunger to understand the world. But even then, something in the threads felt stretched. From an early age, Ari measured herself against others. She wondered if she was too much, too emotional, too intense, too sensitive. And at the same time, she feared she was not enough, not loud enough to be seen, not strong enough to belong. This tension, at her core, between self-doubt and yearning, slowly thinned her sense of identity. The F in fabric, her fragile sense of self, was already beginning to wear. By the time she hit high school, the world around her had grown louder, faster, more complex. She was kind, but quiet, present, but rarely chosen, not bullied, not rejected, just not held. In class, she answered thoughtfully, but not often enough to be noticed. At parties, she was invited, but never sought out. In photos, she stood at the edge, smiling, but slightly apart. Over time, her place in the weave loosened. The A in fabric, alienation, set in like a slow drift. By 18, the loneliness had become internalized. She didn't want to trouble anyone with how she was really feeling. She told herself, "Other people have it worse. I shouldn't complain." But beneath that self-silencing was a belief growing roots. That maybe, just maybe, she was more weight than worth. That her sadness was too much. That her presence might even be a strain. This is how the B in fabric appears, burdensomeness. Not as a cry for help, but as a quiet decision to shrink herself down. And inside, her thoughts began to spiral. "You're always letting people down. You should be over this by now. You're too sensitive. You're not coping properly." These weren't just passing thoughts. They looped over and over. Even when she tried to think differently, the voice returned, critical, repetitive, exhausting. The R, repetitive rumination, dug deep. A single thread rubbing the same spot raw. Then came the winter that broke everything open. Her parents separated suddenly, no warning, just a fracture. Her health faltered, an autoimmune diagnosis, unpredictable and draining. And just as she was trying to adjust, her job disappeared, gone with a single email. She tried to keep moving, to find options, but every path forward seemed blocked. She would send application and hear nothing. She would ask for support and get silence. She began to believe that no effort could make a difference, that she was boxed in, that nothing would change. This is the I in fabric, inescapable circumstances. The feeling of being stuck, not just in situation, but in the story itself. And finally, the colors began to fade. Music, once her refuge, felt hollow. Her dreams, vivid and vibrant, dissolved into grey outlines. She woke in the mornings not with dread, but with nothing, just heaviness, stillness. She couldn't picture a future, not because she didn't want one, but because it no longer had shape or light. That's the sea, the curtain of despair. Ari wasn't thinking about dying. She just couldn't imagine living. And this is often where we meet someone like Ari. Not when things first begin to fray, but when the cloth is threadbare, close to tearing. When the person is still functioning, still showing up to class, still smiling when spoken to, but inside they're unraveling. And this is where fabric matters most. Because fabric helps us notice. It helps us tune into those first signs, the thinning self, the fading connection, the growing belief that one is a burden. It helps us ask, not just, are you okay? But where does it hurt? As clinicians, carers, companions, we don't need to take over the loom. We don't need to fix the pattern. But we can sit beside it. We can say, I see where the threads are pulling. I see how long you have been holding this together. Because what hurts the most is almost always tied to what matters the most. And when we help someone name that pain, when we honor it, hold it, explore it, we begin the slow work of reweaving one stitch at a time. Before we close today's episode, take a moment. Think about someone you know, Ari, or maybe yourself, whose fabric might be thinning quietly. What might it mean to sit beside the person? Not with advice or fixes, but with presence. Fabric reminds us prevention isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet care gently offered, one stitch at a time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for holding space. Next time, we'll move into thread, the first appearance of suicidal ideation, and how to gently respond when the idea of death begins to whisper. But now, here's a song to close our time together, woven from Ari's story and the threads we have traced today.
She once spun joy from silver thread, asked deep questions, danced and read. But under all her curious light, lace seams pulled taut, stretched too tight. Her sense of self, a jumper worn, soft in parts and others torn. She smiled wide, but deep inside, her confidence had learned to hide. You're too sensitive, you disappoint. Thoughts caught like thread on a jagged point. She tried to mend them, think them through, but the spiral stitched her spirit blue. F is the fragile name she wore. A is the ache of being ignored. B is the burden she never shared. R is the reel of thoughts ensnared. I is the trap that had no door. C is the curtain that closed the floor. This is fabric, thread by thread, a quiet unraveling few can tread. Winter came with grief and loss, a job, a health scare, one more cost. The exits faded one by one, and all her color came undone. The future blurred into a fog, even music felt like a hollow log. Hope once hummed beneath her days, now even that had lost its place. This is where we meet her, not too late, not after the fall, but near the gate. Not to take the needle in our hand, but to sit and help her understand where the thread is pulling tight, where the cloth has lost its light. 'Cause pain shows up where meaning lives, F is the feeling she couldn't name. A is the ache of silent shame. B is the story she carried alone. R is the loop that never was shown. I is the cage of circumstance. C is the loss of a second chance. The fabric worn is fabric still, and threads can shift with gentle will. Every fray began with feeling, and every tear begins with thread. But even worn cloth holds a promise that it's not the end, just where we're